Hey, everybody, welcome back. We're going to continue our discussion about the problems that led to the Civil War. Again, we're talking about sectionalism. Remember, that's where you care about your part of the country more than you care about the country as a whole. This means that the Northerners care more about what's best for the North than they do about what's best for the South, and vice versa. And neither side can really come to a consensus. So we're going to talk now about slavery. The last time we talked about tariffs, this is a lot more about slavery. So remember back to when we were talking about the Constitution. Since the very beginning of our country, we've been having debates and compromises and arguments about slavery. So remember, we went all the way back to the 3/5 compromise, where we basically said slaves count as partial person for representation, partial value for property. So they kind of a little bit of both in terms of politics, right? And there also was a balance of power that was created, and slavery wasn't allowed to be touched until 1808, and that got pushed back further after the Constitutional Convention, actually. So one of the first things where we start to make compromises again about slavery is with the Missouri Compromise. So in 1819, Missouri becomes a territory, and they want to become a state. There's a lot of people moving there. So basically what we did is allow Missouri in as a slave state, and then Maine would be split off from Massachusetts, and it would become a new state and be a free state. So now we have a balance again. Remember, that was one of the reasons that Texas created a problem, is because it was a slave state. That was one of the reasons we didn't want to let them into the Union. But now we can basically start this new idea of letting in states in pairs, one slave and one free at a time. This basically drew a line across what we purchased from the French in the Louisiana Purchase. North of the line was free, south was slave. This line is called the Mason-Dixon line. Basically, as new states come in, they're allowed in as pairs. So Arkansas becomes a slave state, Michigan free. Florida slave, Iowa free. Texas slave, Wisconsin free. And so we kind of match them together so that we keep a balance of power. But we gain a whole bunch of land after the Mexican-American War. So it was going to be difficult to decide what was going to be slave and what was going to be free, especially because most of this territory is actually south of that line. So if we allow the same rules to apply, then either there's going to be some huge states south of that line and some small states north, or there's going to be, it's not going to work, right? So basically the Southerners threatened to leave if the North forces them to make these states be all free states. They actually threatened to secede from the Union. Remember, secede means to leave the country. So Henry Clay comes up with a compromise. Basically, he says, okay, California will be a free state, and then Utah and New Mexico will be able to use something called popular sovereignty. You should probably write this down. Popular sovereignty is where the people decide something. So basically he wanted to say, okay, Utah and New Mexico can then just vote. Do they want to be free or do they want to be slave? He also said, as a part of this, because we're letting these states decide, in order to get the Southerners on the side of this, he actually says, okay, and we'll also make something called the Fugitive Slave Law, which basically says that northern states have to ship captured slaves back south. So a lot of the northern states were just ignoring any freed slave, any runaway slaves. They would maybe even know that someone was runaway, and they would just be like, oh, not a big deal, not our problem. But with this new law, those northern states could be in big trouble if they don't catch those slaves and send them back to the south. And so this compromise was passed. This cartoon is a little bit freaky. This is leading to a conflict that arises in Kansas. So you can see this guy being held down here. He's actually a free soiler, basically someone who wants to move to an area that is free, so he doesn't have to compete with slaveholders. He doesn't want to have slaves, right? But basically, these politicians are forcing slavery down his throat, right? They're basically saying, nope, Kansas is going to be a slave state, and you have to either become a slaveholder and to be able to compete, or die. You can see the guy hanging in the background. Maybe you didn't notice it at first. There's a lot of violence that happens in Kansas, so we'll talk about. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act was in 1854. It was passed largely with the support of several people. But basically, Stephen Douglas wanted Nebraska to be one huge territory. But Southerners didn't like that because Nebraska would probably end up being a free state. So they said, no, we need to split this huge Nebraska territory into two. So Douglas comes up with a bill that splits these two territories, and popular sovereignty is used to decide if they're going to be free or slave. Again, that's the people deciding. So they have a vote. Basically, what happens is a bunch of Missourians, I don't know how to say it. I've heard it both ways. Missourians is what I hear more often. Anyway, they crossed the border and voted illegally. They ended up voting for slavery because, remember, the people from Missouri, they want to spread. They want to be able to buy more property. They want to be able to get land for their sons. And they need to be able to spread in order to do that, right? And they want to have Kansas as an option. So they sneak across the border, vote for slavery. The Northerners, the people who'd moved there from the North, basically said, this is voter fraud. And they said, nope, the election was wrong. They actually set up two competing governments in Kansas. And there was actually a minor civil war here. What ended up happening was there was a lot of violence. A gang of guys actually attacked a newspaper that was anti-slavery. They destroyed the homes of people and started just being crazy, right? Well, John Brown, basically, this story is a little weird. Get ready. It's a little weird. John Brown claims that an angel came to him and told him that in order to serve God, he needed to become a vigilante and take vengeance on these people. So he actually, with a gang of people that believed him, they actually went and dragged men out of their beds in the middle of the night and beheaded them with an axe, or with a sword, actually, in front of their families. Pretty messed up. So that's leads to a bunch of violence in Kansas, and there's a whole lot of drama there for sure. Speaking of drama, there was a speech made by Charles Sumner. He was a anti-slavery man, and he made this huge speech where he said all kinds of terrible things about Southerners, and a few Southerners in particular. One of the Southerners that he attacked personally, he actually said a lot of stuff about him. Well, his cousin was named Preston Brooks. He was also a senator. And so Preston Brooks actually was thinking about challenging Sumner to a duel. But the rules are that two gentlemen can engage in a duel. Well, from Brooks's opinion, the things that Charles Sumner said in this speech that he made it so that he was no longer a gentleman. He used language and analogies and things like that he said, basically says he's no longer a gentleman. So having a duel with him would be elevating the status of Sumner. So instead of fighting a duel with him, Preston Brooks, a couple of days after this speech, gets a cane and walks up to Charles Sumner as he's working at his desk on the Senate floor and starts beating him mercilessly. He just kept hitting this poor guy, and nobody stepped in to do anything, actually, for a while. Charles Sumner actually ended up in the hospital with a lot of broken bones. It was not pretty. Serious beatdown on the Senate floor. Weird. True story. Anyway, there were a bunch of things that made it so that we couldn't compromise anymore. Part of it was this sectionalism, this idea that we had to be one or the other. You can't be there's no middle ground anymore. Dred Scott was another thing that made people not be able to compromise anymore. Basically, African Americans were viewed as not people legally. They couldn't challenge anyone in court. They couldn't even testify in court. And slaveholders had all the power. So slaveholders could take slaves into federal territory, which includes anything that's not a state yet, any territory. It includes the capital, Washington, D.C. And basically, Congress can't do anything about it because of the Dred Scott decision. So basically, three things led to the end of compromise. Three things make it so we can't compromise anymore. One's popular sovereignty, because now the people decide. So the Senate has no control, or Congress has no control over whether a state is going to be free or slave, so they can't make deals. They can't work together on anything. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, basically forcing popular sovereignty on everything. And then the Dred Scott decision. So those are the three big things. Political parties now can't compromise anymore. They can't work together. The Southerners were mostly made up of Democrats and Whigs, but A few other people were of course not a part of those parties, but that was most Southerners. They were generally pro-slavery. Um, and the politicians don't really want to go into a conflict, but they feel like they're getting backed into a corner. And in the North, um, another party's created called the Free Soil Party. Basically, these were people who were anti-slavery from both of the major parties. They formed this party where they basically said free soil, free speech, free labor, and free men. They want to keep slavery out of the new territories. These two parties go at it and don't agree at all, as you can imagine. The Free Soil Party doesn't really do all that much. So they don't actually stay around for too long, but they actually lead to the rise of the Republican Party. The Republican Party has a similar goal. They want to stop the spread of slavery. So people from the Free Soilers, Northern Democrats, wealthy businessmen, they all join this new party and try and get someone elected. Their first candidate is John C. Fremont. Remember, he's the Pathfinder. He's the explorer. He was a governor of California, and he actually almost won the election without any Southern support at all. He was really, really close, but he lost the election of 1856. That's the first Republican failure for a presidential election. The next one would be successful, which we'll talk about tomorrow. Boom. Anyway, that's it for today. Make sure you do your homework. Look at the map that I'm going to put up hopefully soon. It's kind of a weird one. It's basically going to be, oh, actually, I apologize. I already put it up. It's a bunch of Civil War sites. So make sure you go over that, use the purpose games that I created. It will help you, I promise. And we'll hopefully do really well on that one. All right, we'll talk to you tomorrow. Adios.